Today, there are over 8 billion humans living in permanent settlements. We wake up in the same house every morning, work in the same buildings, shop at the same stores. We're anchored to addresses, tied to property lines, bound to cities that sprawl across landscapes our ancestors once roamed freely. We've built civilizations on the idea that staying in one place is normal, that moving around is the exception. But if you had looked at the world 12,000 years ago, the picture would have been shockingly different. Every single human on Earth was a nomad. Not most humans, not some humans, every single one. There wasn't a single permanent settlement anywhere on the planet. No villages, no farms, no fixed addresses. Just small groups of people constantly moving, following herds, tracking seasons, never staying anywhere longer than a few weeks or months. The entire human species, from the frozen tundras of Europe to the grasslands of Africa to the forests of Asia, was on the move. And then, in what amounts to the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, we stopped. Something happened around 12,000 years ago that changed everything. For the first time in millions of years of human existence, people decided to stay put, to build permanent homes, to plant crops and wait months for them to grow, to abandon the nomadic lifestyle that had sustained our species since the beginning. This wasn't just a change in lifestyle. This was the most profound transformation in human history, more significant than the Industrial Revolution, more impactful than the invention of the Internet. Because this decision, this shift from wandering to settling, created the foundation for literally everything that came after. Cities, governments, writing, mathematics, art, religion, social hierarchies, wealth inequality, armies, empires. All of it traces back to the moment humans stopped moving and started staying. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make it. So subscribe, maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's like Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, California at midnight, all at once. Here's what makes this story so fascinating. Nobody forced humans to settle down. There was no apocalyptic event that made nomadic life impossible. The climate was actually getting better, not worse. Resources were becoming more abundant. By all logical reasoning, hunter-gatherers should have kept doing what they'd been successfully doing for hundreds of thousands of years, but they didn't. In multiple places around the world, completely independently, human groups made the radical decision to stop moving, to stake everything on staying in one place. And here's the really crazy part. This decision made life harder at first, not easier. Early farmers worked longer hours than hunter-gatherers. They had worse nutrition, more disease, higher infant mortality. Skeletons from early agricultural communities show signs of malnutrition and stress that nomadic populations didn't have. So why did they do it? Why would anyone willingly choose a harder, more dangerous lifestyle? That's the mystery we're going to unravel. Because the answer isn't simple. It's not just about discovering that seeds grow into plants. Hunter-gatherers knew that. They'd known it for thousands of years. The shift to agriculture wasn't about knowledge. It was about something deeper, something that fundamentally changed how humans thought about their relationship to the land, to food, to each other. The story starts around 12,000 years ago, in a period geologists call the Neolithic Revolution. Though revolution might be the wrong word, this wasn't sudden, it wasn't violent. It was more like a slow tide that gradually reshaped the entire human world. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, groups began experimenting with cultivating wild grains. In China, communities started managing rice paddies. In Mesoamerica, people figured out how to domesticate maize. Each region developing agriculture independently, as if the entire species had simultaneously reached some invisible threshold. What made this moment in time special? What changed in the human mind or the human environment that made settlement suddenly possible? And once people started settling, why couldn't they go back? Because here's what most people don't realize. Once you commit to farming, you're trapped. You can't just abandon your fields and return to nomadic life. Your population has grown beyond what hunting and gathering can support. You've forgotten the old knowledge of tracking herds and finding wild foods. Your children have only ever known permanent homes. There's no reverse gear on the agricultural revolution. We're going to walk through this transformation step by step. From the last ice age when every human was a nomad, through the warming period that changed everything, to the first tentative experiments with staying put, to the moment when settlement became permanent and irreversible. We'll see how climate, culture, technology, and pure accident combine to create the world we inhabit today, a world of cities and nations and borders that would be completely unrecognizable to our nomadic ancestors from just 12,000 years ago. This is the story of the greatest shift in human history, the moment we stopped wandering and started building the world we know today. For 200,000 years, your ancestors lived as nomads, not because they hadn't figured out a better way, not because they were primitive or backward, but because nomadic life worked. It worked spectacularly well. In fact, judged purely on sustainability, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle was the most successful survival strategy in human history. 200,000 years of continuous success. Compare that to agriculture, which we've been trying for 12,000 years and has already pushed us to the edge of ecological collapse multiple times. So let's be clear about what we're talking about here. When we say nomadic, we're not describing aimless wandering. We're describing sophisticated, highly organized societies that move through landscapes with encyclopedic precision. These weren't lost tribes stumbling around hoping to find food. These were expert ecologists who knew every plant, every animal, every water source, every seasonal change in territories that could span hundreds of square miles. Picture a typical band, about 25 to 30 people, maybe 6 or 7 families. Everyone's related by blood or marriage. You've got grandparents, parents, children, a few cousins. This isn't random. Basic anthropology tells us this is the optimal size for a mobile human group. Small enough to move quickly and find sufficient resources, large enough to defend territory, share labor, and maintain genetic diversity. Put fewer than 20 people together, and they're vulnerable to disasters, one hunting accident, one difficult childbirth, and the group's viability collapses. Put more than 40 together, and they can't find enough food in any single area to sustain everyone without depleting resources, so 25 to 30. That number shows up in hunter-gatherer societies on every continent, in every climate. It's written into our social psychology, hardwired by hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection. Even today, research shows that 30 is about the maximum number of people with whom we can maintain intimate, meaningful relationships. Coincidence? Not even close. These bands didn't live in isolation. They were nodes in networks that stretched across continents. Every band knew about the bands on either side of them. They met at certain times of year for trade, for marriage exchanges, for ceremonies. Information flowed through these networks like electricity through circuits. If one group discovered a new food processing technique within a generation, every band within 500 miles would know about it. If another group found a new source of tool-making stone, trade routes would develop to distribute it. This was globalization, hunter-gatherer style. Now here's what a typical day looked like, and this is going to surprise you because it contradicts everything we've been told about how hard life was before civilization. Wake up around dawn, not because you have to, but because humans are diurnal animals and sleeping past sunrise when you don't have artificial light feels wrong. Spend maybe an hour on maintenance tasks, repairing tools, processing food from yesterday's gathering, tending the fire. Then, depending on the season and what's needed, either the men head out to hunt or a mixed group goes gathering, or both. Here's the crucial part. The average hunter-gatherer worked about 4 to 6 hours a day on subsistence activities. That's it. 4 to 6 hours of actual food procurement and preparation. The rest of the day, socializing, playing with kids, making art, telling stories, resting. Archaeological evidence and studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies both confirm this. Our ancestors had more leisure time than any agricultural or industrial society in history. More leisure time than you have. More leisure time than anyone grinding away at a 40-hour work week has. And the work itself. It wasn't the brutal, exhausting labour we imagine. Gathering was often a social activity. Groups of women and children walking through familiar territories, talking, laughing, teaching the young ones which plants to collect and which to avoid. They weren't hauling heavy loads mile after mile. They were picking berries, digging roots, collecting nuts, all within a few miles of camp. Hunting was more intensive, but it was also irregular. You might spend 2 days tracking and killing a large animal, then not need to hunt again for a week. The knowledge required for this lifestyle was staggering. A typical adult hunter-gatherer could identify hundreds of plant species by sight. They knew which were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They knew when each plant would be ready to harvest, where different species grew, how to process them to remove toxins or increase nutritional value. They could read landscapes like you read street signs. That ridge. Water flows down the north side in spring. That valley. Deer migrate through in autumn. Those trees. They'll have edible nuts in 2 months. This wasn't information you looked up. This was knowledge embedded in your brain from childhood, reinforced through daily practice, tested by survival itself. The same went for animal behavior. Hunters could identify animals by their tracks, their scat, their feeding patterns. They understood migration routes, breeding seasons, territorial behaviors. They knew how to predict where game would be at different times of year. More impressively, they understood animal psychology well enough to anticipate reactions, plan ambushes, drive prey into kill zones. Modern wildlife biologists spend years studying animal behavior. Your ancestors learned it by age 15 because their lives depended on it. Seasonal knowledge was equally sophisticated. These people didn't have calendars, but they could track time with precision that would impress modern astronomers. They read the stars, the angle of the sun, the behavior of animals, the flowering of plants. They knew that when the certain constellation appeared on the eastern horizon at dawn, the salmon would be running in the rivers. They knew that 3 weeks after the first frost the acorns would be ready. They knew that when the geese flew north, it was time to move to the summer hunting grounds. This knowledge wasn't just practical, it was sacred. It was encoded in myths, rituals, songs that had been passed down for hundreds of generations. Knowledge transmission was the most important activity in these societies. Grandparents teaching, grandchildren the names of plants, experienced hunters showing young men how to read tracks, healers passing on the properties of medicinal herbs, storytellers preserving the geographic knowledge of their territories in narratives that could be remembered and repeated exactly. And the territories themselves were vast. In temperate regions, a single band might range over 200 to 500 square miles in a year. In arid regions, it could be even larger. But they weren't wandering randomly through this space. They were following seasonal rounds, circular migration patterns that took them to different resource zones at different times of year. Winter camp by the river where fish were plentiful and wood was abundant. Spring movement to the uplands where new plant growth and migrating game animals provided easy food. Summer at the coast or near permanent water sources. Autumn back to the lowlands for nut harvests and final hunting before winter. These patterns were so regular, so deeply embedded in the social structure, that different bands had effectively carved up entire continents into overlapping but recognized territories. You knew which areas your band had primary access to. You knew which areas were shared with neighboring bands. You knew which areas belonged to others and required permission to enter. Property rights existed, just not in the form of fences and deeds. They existed in mutual understanding, in networks of relationship and obligation. The material culture of these mobile peoples was ingeniously simple. Everything you owned had to be carried, so nothing was wasted. Tools were multifunctional, lightweight, easily replaced. A basic toolkit might include a dozen carefully crafted stone tools, some wooden implements, leather bags, fire-making equipment, and that's about it. But don't mistake simplicity for primitiveness. Those stone tools represented thousands of years of technological refinement. The best Stone Age spear points are so perfectly crafted that modern knappers using metal tools struggle to replicate them. Shelters were temporary but effective. In warm climates, simple windbreaks or open-sided structures made from branches and leaves. In colder regions, more substantial structures covered with animal hides. In winter, some groups built semi-subterranean pit houses that could be occupied for several months. But even these were designed to be abandoned. You'd return to the same location next year, but you wouldn't try to maintain the structure through the off-season. Why bother? By the time you came back, you could build a new one in a day. Now let's talk about diet, because this is where things get really interesting. Pre-agricultural humans ate better than most people do today. Not just better in some abstract sense. Better in terms of nutrition, variety, food security. A typical hunter-gatherer diet included 50 to 100 different food species. 50 to 100. Compare that to modern agriculture, which feeds most of humanity with fewer than 20 crop species. This dietary diversity provided complete nutrition. Proteins from meat, fish, and insects. Fats from nuts, seeds, and animals. Carbohydrates from roots, fruits, and grains. Vitamins and minerals from the huge variety of plant foods. Skeletal evidence confirms this. Pre-agricultural humans were taller, had stronger bones, better teeth, and fewer signs of nutritional deficiencies than the first agricultural populations. When humans switched to farming, average height dropped by about 6 inches. It didn't recover until the 20th century. Tooth decay increased dramatically. Signs of malnutrition appear in the archaeological record. The first farmers were shorter, sicker, and died younger than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. But here's the thing about hunter-gatherer nutrition. It wasn't consistent. Unlike agricultural societies with stored grains, hunter-gatherers experienced feast and famine cycles. When resources were abundant, food was plentiful and varied. When resources were scarce, times got hard. But, and this is crucial, famines were rare and localized. If one area experienced drought or animal population crashes, groups could move to better territories. The mobility that defined nomadic life was itself a form of food security. This brings us to the environmental context. For most of the last 200,000 years, your ancestors were living through ice ages. Not constant frozen wastelands, but cycles of cold glacial periods alternating with warmer interglacial periods. During glacial maxima, ice sheets covered much of North America, Europe, and Northern Asia. Sea levels were 400 feet lower than today, exposing land bridges and coastal plains. The climate was drier, colder, more seasonal. But here's what's remarkable. Humans thrived in these conditions. They adapted to environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. They lived in deserts and mountains, coastal zones and inland plains. They hunted mammoth in Siberia and gathered shellfish in South Africa. They crafted clothes from animal skins that allowed them to survive temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in hours. They learned to preserve meat through freezing, drying, and smoking. They figured out how to find and maintain fire even in wet conditions. This adaptability was humanity's superpower. While other species were confined to narrow ecological niches, humans were turning the entire planet into their niche. And they were doing it with Stone Age technology. Nothing more sophisticated than carefully worked stone, wood, and hide. No metals, no wheels, no writing. Just encyclopedic knowledge, sophisticated social organization, and the cognitive flexibility to solve novel problems. The last ice age began ending around 15,000 years ago. Temperatures started rising, ice sheets began retreating, sea levels started climbing. Coastlines that had been home to human communities for thousands of years were flooded. Entire landscapes transformed within a few generations. This was environmental change on a scale that would test every adaptation humans had developed. But your ancestors had survived worse. They'd survived the genetic bottleneck 900,000 years earlier. They'd survived multiple glacial cycles. They'd spread across every continent except Antarctica. They'd outlasted Neanderthals and Denisovans. They were expert survivors, master adapters, the most successful large mammal species on the planet. And their nomadic lifestyle had made all of it possible. The ability to move when conditions changed, the knowledge networks that allowed rapid information sharing, the flexible social structures that could merge and split as needed, the relatively low population densities that prevented resource depletion. For 200,000 years this system had worked perfectly. So why did they stop? Why did some groups in certain places make the radical decision to stay put, to plant seeds and wait for harvest instead of following game and gathering wild foods, to build permanent structures instead of portable shelters, to tie themselves to specific locations instead of ranging freely across landscapes they knew intimately? It wasn't because nomadic life had failed. It was because the world was changing in ways that made a different strategy possible. And once a few groups made that shift, everything else followed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand exactly what was changing in the environment. What happened 12,000 years ago that made settlement not just possible, but attractive? Because the answer isn't what you think. Around 15,000 years ago, something extraordinary began to happen. After 100,000 years of Ice Age conditions, after millennia of your ancestors huddling in whatever shelters they could find, tracking animals across frozen tundra, living as they had always lived, moving, hunting, surviving, the world started to warm. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but year by year. Generation by generation, the ice began to melt. Picture yourself standing where your grandparents stood, where their grandparents stood, where countless generations before them had stood. You're looking at the same landscape they knew, the same massive ice sheets stretching to the horizon, the same frozen rivers, the same bitter winds that cut through your furs and make winter survival a constant battle against death. But something's different. The spring thaw is lasting a little longer this year. The summer melt is exposing ground that's been frozen for as long as anyone can remember. The herds are staying in areas they used to pass through quickly. Small changes, subtle changes, the kind of changes you might not even notice in a single lifetime. But over generations, over centuries, those small changes were rewriting the rules of human existence. Because here's the thing about the end of the Ice Age. It wasn't just a matter of the temperature going up a few degrees, it was a complete transformation of the planet's surface, a reshaping of continents, coastlines, and ecosystems on a scale that hadn't been seen for hundreds of thousands of years. The ice sheets covering North America and Europe were kilometers thick, mountains of ice so massive they actually depressed the Earth's crust beneath them. When they started to melt, they released water that had been locked in frozen form for millennia. Sea levels began to rise, not quickly, not overnight, but steadily. Over the course of several thousand years, the oceans rose by roughly 120 meters. That's 400 feet. That's a 40-story building. Coastal areas that had been home to nomadic bands for thousands of years were gradually submerged. The Bering Land Bridge connecting Asia and North America, a highway that humans had used to colonize the Americas, slowly disappeared beneath the waves. The connection between Britain and continental Europe, a broad plain where humans had hunted mammoths and reindeer, became the English Channel. Entire landscapes that had supported human populations simply vanished. But at the same time, entirely new landscapes were appearing. As the ice retreated, it left behind a transformed world. Valleys that had been scoured by glaciers, lakes formed in depressions carved by moving ice, rivers flowing in new patterns, seeking new paths to the sea, and most importantly, land. Vast expanses of land that had been buried under ice for 100,000 years were suddenly exposed to sunlight again. This wasn't barren wasteland. The retreating glaciers left behind incredibly fertile soil, ground-up rock, rich in minerals, perfect for plant growth. And plants arrived fast. Seeds blown by wind, carried by birds, transported in the fur of migrating animals. Within just a few centuries, areas that had been frozen tundra were becoming grasslands, then forests. Your ancestors watched this transformation with a mixture of opportunity and loss. The animals they'd relied on for millennia, the Ice Age megafauna perfectly adapted to cold conditions, were struggling. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, massive cave bears, all of them specialized for life in cold grasslands and tundra. As their habitats shrank and changed, their populations crashed. For nomadic hunters, this was catastrophic. Imagine your entire survival strategy built around tracking and killing animals that were now disappearing. Your grandparents' knowledge about migration routes, hunting techniques, processing methods, all of it becoming less relevant with each passing generation. But evolution doesn't care about tradition. Evolution rewards adaptation. And the same climate changes that were killing off the megafauna were creating entirely new opportunities. Nowhere was this more dramatic than in a crescent-shaped region stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel and Palestine down into Egypt. We call it the Fertile Crescent today, but 15,000 years ago your ancestors would have called it something else. Maybe they called it the Land of Grass, because that's what was appearing there. Wild grains. Now grasses had existed throughout the Ice Age, but they'd been scattered, sparse, unreliable. You could collect grass seeds if you were desperate, spend hours gathering tiny quantities of food that required extensive processing to become edible. It was survival food, not a staple. But as the climate warmed and stabilized, something remarkable happened. The wild ancestors of wheat, barley, and rye began to flourish. Seasonal rainfall patterns became more predictable. Spring rains, summer growth, autumn harvest. The same cycle, year after year. And these grasses weren't just scattered plants anymore. They were forming dense stands, fields of wild grain that would ripen at predictable times. For nomadic bands passing through these areas, this was like discovering a gold mine. Suddenly there were locations where you could harvest enormous quantities of food in a relatively short time. Food that could be stored if you figured out how to keep it dry. Food that didn't run away or fight back or required days of trekking through difficult terrain. The early experiments were tentative. Maybe a band would return to the same stand of wild wheat year after year, timing their migration to arrive just as the grain ripened. They'd harvest what they could carry, then move on, following the traditional nomadic pattern. But here's where it gets interesting. The climate shift wasn't just creating fields of wild grain, it was creating predictability, and predictability is the enemy of nomadism. Before the warming, climate patterns had been chaotic. You never knew if winter would come early or late, if summer would be wet or dry, if the herds would follow their usual routes or vanish into territories you couldn't access. Flexibility was survival, moving constantly, following opportunities wherever they appeared, never committing to a single location or strategy. But as global temperatures stabilized, as the massive ice sheets stopped their advance and retreat, seasonal patterns became more reliable. In the Fertile Crescent, you could count on spring rains. In river valleys, you could predict when floods would come. In coastal areas, you could anticipate fish migrations. This predictability fundamentally changed the survival calculus. For the first time in human history, staying in one place started to make sense. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but in certain locations with particularly abundant and reliable resources. The animal populations were changing too. The megafauna were dying out, but smaller animals were thriving. Deer, wild pigs, gazelles, birds. These animals had faster reproduction rates than mammoths. They could adapt more quickly to changing conditions, and critically they had different behavior patterns. Ice Age megafauna had to migrate long distances because their food sources were spread out and unpredictable. If you wanted to hunt them, you had to follow them. But the smaller animals flourishing in the warmer world? Many of them were territorial. They stayed in relatively small ranges, moving only seasonally or not at all. This meant you could learn their habits. You could predict where they'd be at different times of year. You could potentially manage their populations, protecting young animals to ensure future hunting, even defending their territories against other predators. Not quite domestication, not yet, but moving in that direction. The transformation was happening at different rates in different places. The Fertile Crescent was experiencing it early and dramatically, because its geography created perfect conditions. Mountains to the north and east, desert to the south, the Mediterranean Sea to the west. As the climate warmed, this region became a kind of ecological sweet spot. Enough rainfall for grass, warm enough for year-round habitation, diverse enough to support multiple food sources. But similar changes were occurring across the world. In East Asia, the Yellow River Valley was transforming into a region of reliable flooding and recession, perfect for the wild ancestors of millet and rice. In Mesoamerica, the wild ancestor of corn, a scraggly grass called teosinte, was starting to produce larger seed heads in response to warming temperatures. In the Andes, wild potatoes were flourishing in the highlands. In New Guinea, wild yams and taro were becoming abundant in the tropical forests. Each region had its own suite of plants and animals that responded to the warming climate, and in each region, nomadic bands were noticing the changes, adapting their movement patterns, beginning to exploit these new reliable resources. But the transition wasn't smooth. Climate change never is. The overall trend was warming, but within that trend were wild fluctuations. The Younger Dryas event around 12,800 years ago saw temperatures crash back toward Ice Age conditions for more than 1,000 years. Communities that had begun to rely on wild grains found their fields dying. Groups that had reduced their territory to focus on predictable resources suddenly faced scarcity. This climate reversal might have actually accelerated the move toward agriculture. When wild resources became unreliable again, some groups responded by trying to manage them more actively, protecting productive stands of grain, removing competing plants, maybe even deliberately planting seeds in favorable locations. These weren't farmers yet, they were still fundamentally nomadic. But they were beginning to blur the line between gathering and cultivation. They were starting to see themselves not just as consumers of resources, but as managers of them. The end of the Younger Dryas, around 11,600 years ago, brought another rapid warming, and this time it stuck. The climate stabilized at levels similar to today. The Ice Age was truly over, and the world your ancestors had known for 100,000 years, the world of constant movement and adaptation, the world where flexibility was everything, that world was dying. In its place was emerging a world of abundance and predictability, a world where the same locations could provide food year after year, a world where investing time and effort in a single location could pay off in ways that constant movement never could. Not everyone saw it. Not everyone believed it. Many bands continued their traditional patterns, following the herds, gathering wild foods, living as humans had always lived. And in many environments, that remained the best strategy. Nomadism didn't disappear because it was wrong. It persisted because in many contexts it was still right. But in those sweet spot locations, in the Fertile Crescent and the Yellow River Valley and the Mesoamerican highlands and half a dozen other places around the world, something new was becoming possible. Something that would have seemed impossible to your Ice Age ancestors. The possibility of staying in one place, not just for a season, but for generations. The climate had created the opportunity. Now it was up to humans to decide whether to take it. And that decision, made independently by different groups in different parts of the world, all around the same time, that decision would change everything about what it meant to be human. The Ice Age world was gone. The warm world was here, and in that warm world the age-old pattern of human nomadism was about to face its greatest challenge. Not from predators or rivals or disasters, but from something far more seductive, the possibility of plenty, the promise of predictability, the dream of staying home. Picture this. You're living about 14,000 years ago in what we now call the Levant, the region stretching from modern-day Turkey down through Syria, Lebanon, and into Israel. The Ice Age is ending. Glaciers that have covered half the northern hemisphere for 100,000 years are finally retreating. And the climate in your part of the world is doing something it hasn't done in millennia. It's becoming predictable, not stable, not perfect, but predictable enough that you can count on certain plants appearing in certain places at certain times of year. Wild wheat and barley growing thick in valley bottoms, nut trees producing reliable harvests, game animals following consistent migration routes. Your people have been nomadic hunter-gatherers for as long as anyone can remember. You follow the food, moving with the seasons, setting up temporary camps near water sources, staying a few weeks or maybe a few months before moving on. It's how humans have lived for hundreds of thousands of years, but something's different now. Some groups have started doing something radical. They're staying put. These people call themselves something we'll never know. Archaeologists call them the Natufians, and they were about to accidentally invent a completely new way of being human. Here's what made the Natufians different. They didn't immediately start farming. They didn't wake up one morning and decide to plant crops. Instead, they discovered something that would have seemed impossible to their ancestors. You could stay in one place and still have enough to eat. The region they inhabited had become an embarrassment of riches. Wild cereals, wheat, barley, and rye grew so densely in some areas that you could harvest more grain in a few weeks than a nomadic group could gather in an entire year of wandering. Gazelle herds migrated through the same valleys every spring and fall, predictable as clockwork. Fish filled rivers that had been dry during the glacial period. So the Natufians started building structures that were meant to last. Not simple windbreaks or temporary shelters, but actual houses. Circular stone foundations, walls of wattle and daub, roofs of branches and reed thatch. Some of these houses show evidence of being occupied, abandoned, and then reoccupied over multiple generations. They weren't fully settled yet. Most groups still moved seasonally, following resource cycles, but they were returning to the same base camps year after year, places they had invested labour in building, places where they stored food and tools, places that were becoming something unprecedented in human history. Home. The archaeological evidence from Natufian sites is fascinating because it shows people caught between two worlds. You find grinding stones, huge mortars and pestles weighing hundreds of pounds, far too heavy to carry around. These weren't tools for nomadic life. These were investments in staying put. But you also find typical hunter-gatherer toolkits, projectile points for hunting, scrapers for processing hides, the full range of technologies needed for mobile life. The Natufians hadn't abandoned nomadism. They were experimenting with something in between, and they were doing something else, something that wouldn't seem significant until much later. They were manipulating plants. Now they weren't farming yet, not deliberately planting and harvesting, but they were managing wild plant populations in ways that would have seemed strange to traditional hunter-gatherers. When you harvest wild wheat, you're selecting. You're choosing which seeds to collect and which to leave behind. And here's where it gets interesting. Wild wheat has a trait that makes it perfect for surviving in nature, but terrible for human harvesting. When the seeds ripen, the seed head shatters, scattering seeds everywhere. It's a great reproductive strategy for the plant. Seeds spread far and wide, increasing chances that some will find good germination sites, but it's awful for humans trying to gather food. By the time you arrive to harvest, half the seeds are already on the ground. So naturally, when Natufian harvesters went out to collect wheat, they preferentially chose plants where the seed heads hadn't shattered yet. Plants with a random genetic mutation that made them hold their seeds a little longer. They didn't know they were doing selection. They were just trying to maximize their harvest, but they were accidentally changing the plant. Because here's what happens next. They bring their harvest back to camp. They process it, grind it, eat it. But they're messy. Like all humans, seeds spill, seeds get dropped around the camp, and in the disturbed soil near human settlements, rich with organic waste and cleared of competing vegetation, those dropped seeds germinate really well. The next year, Wheat is growing right near the camp. Convenient. So people harvest that too. And again, they preferentially harvest the seeds that haven't shattered yet. Generation after generation, year after year, people are selecting for wheat that holds its seeds longer. They don't know they're doing it. They're just harvesting food. But they're creating a new variety of wheat, one that won't exist anywhere except near human settlements, one that depends on humans for its reproduction. This is proto-farming, the accidental domestication that happens before anyone even conceives of deliberate agriculture. The same thing was happening with other plants. Lentils, chickpeas, and various nuts all started showing signs of human selection during this period. Seeds getting bigger because people preferentially collected the biggest ones. Seed coats getting thinner because people chose plants that were easier to process. None of this was intentional, but it was transformative. And then there were the animals. Around Natufian camps, archaeologists find something curious. Dog burials. Not wolves, dogs. The first domesticated animal, and nobody knows exactly how it happened. The leading theory goes something like this. Wolves were attracted to human settlements because of waste, bones, scraps, the garbage that accumulates when people stay in one place. Bold wolves who could tolerate human proximity got access to easy food. Humans probably tolerated them because they barked at intruders, provided an early warning system against predators and rival human groups. Over generations, the least aggressive wolves were most successful around humans, and humans, probably without really meaning to, started preferring the friendliest ones. Maybe children played with wolf puppies. Maybe people threw scraps to wolves that seemed particularly helpful. Whatever the mechanism, natural selection was happening fast. Within a few thousand years, you had animals that looked different from wolves. Floppy ears, shorter snouts, varied coat colours, all the signs of domestication. The Natufians had created dogs, or maybe more accurately, dogs, and humans had created each other, forming a partnership that would prove crucial when true agriculture finally emerged. But the Natufians weren't the only ones experimenting. All across the Fertile Crescent, different groups were discovering similar strategies. Semi-permanent camps near reliable resources, seasonal harvesting of wild cereals, management of plant populations, the establishment of regular gathering sites. And some of these gathering sites were becoming something extraordinary. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt started excavating a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. What he found changed everything we thought we knew about the transition to settled life. Göbekli Tepe isn't a village, it's not a settlement at all. It's a temple complex, massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing over 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures, elaborate carvings of animals covering the stones, lions, boars, foxes, gazelles, snakes, birds, evidence of enormous communal feasts, thousands of animal bones showing people gathered here in massive numbers to eat, celebrate, and worship. Here's what makes Göbekli Tepe mind-blowing. It was built around 11,500 years ago by people who are still hunter-gatherers. No farming yet, no permanent villages, no domesticated animals except possibly early dogs. Just mobile groups coming together periodically to build something that would have required thousands of hours of coordinated labour. Think about what this means. You need to quarry these massive stones, transport them to the site, and erect them in precise arrangements. You need to feed hundreds, maybe thousands of people during construction. You need social organisation capable of coordinating labour across multiple groups. You need reasons compelling enough to make people invest enormous effort in a place they don't even live. Göbekli Tepe suggests that maybe we've had the sequence backwards. For decades, archaeologists assumed agriculture came first, then settlement, then complex social organization, then monumental architecture and religion. But Göbekli Tepe implies it might have happened in reverse. Maybe religion and ritual gathering came first. Maybe the need to support these gatherings, to feed massive numbers of people converging on sacred sites, created the pressure that led to agriculture. Maybe we didn't settle down to farm. Maybe we farmed so we could settle down near our temples. Either way, what's clear is that between about 14,000 and 10,000 years ago, something fundamental was shifting in human behavior. Groups were establishing territories, returning to the same locations year after year. They were investing labor in structures and landscapes. They were beginning to see certain places as special, worth defending, worth improving. And crucially, they were learning. With each generation, knowledge accumulated, where the best wild wheat grew, when to harvest for maximum yield, how to process and store seeds to prevent spoilage, which plant varieties produced the most food, which animals were most tolerant of human proximity. This wasn't random trial and error. This was systematic knowledge building over hundreds of generations. Grandparents teaching children, who taught their grandchildren, creating chains of information transfer that grew more sophisticated with each iteration. Archaeological sites from this period show increasingly elaborate storage facilities, pits lined with stone and clay to keep grain dry, elevated platforms to protect food from rodents, evidence of food processing on an industrial scale, massive grinding installations where dozens of people could work together processing harvests. They are also developing new technologies specifically for this semi-settled lifestyle. Sickle blades, with a distinctive sheen from cutting cereal stalks. Basket weaving, crucial for transporting and storing plant foods. Pottery was still thousands of years away, but they were creating storage containers from stone, hide, and woven materials, and the populations were growing. When you're nomadic, there are natural limits on population size. You can only have as many children as you can carry. Women in nomadic societies typically space birth 3 to 4 years apart because you can't travel with multiple infants. But when you're staying in one place, even seasonally, those constraints disappear. You can have children closer together. Infant survival rates improve because you're not constantly moving vulnerable newborns through dangerous terrain. Food storage means you're less vulnerable to seasonal scarcity. Natufian populations were growing faster than any human populations in history. Archaeological surveys show the number and size of sites increasing dramatically during this period. More people, in more places, all experimenting with this new semi-settled lifestyle. But they were also discovering the downsides. When you stay in one place, waste accumulates. Diseases spread more easily in dense populations. Resources that seemed inexhaustible when you were nomadic start showing signs of depletion when hundreds of people are exploiting them year-round. Some Natufian sites show evidence of resource stress. Smaller game animals being hunted, suggesting larger animals were becoming scarce. More reliance on plant foods that required intensive processing. Signs that the easy abundance of the early period was beginning to give way to competition and scarcity. And then, about 12,800 years ago, disaster struck. The climate that had been warming and stabilizing suddenly reversed. Temperatures plunged, rainfall decreased dramatically. This event, called the Younger Dryas, lasted for more than 1,000 years, and it hit the Natufians hard. The wild cereals they had been relying on, those abundant fields of wheat and barley, they started failing. Harvests that had once required weeks of labour could be gathered in days. And they weren't enough. Some Natufian groups abandoned their semi-permanent sites and returned to full nomadism, spreading out to exploit more diverse resources. But others made a different choice. They had invested too much in their settlements, their storage facilities, their territorial knowledge. They had populations too large to easily return to mobile life. So instead of abandoning their lands, they intensified their relationship with the plants. They started deliberately planting seeds, not just harvesting wild stands. They began clearing competing vegetation, creating fields. They experimented with irrigation, moving water to where they wanted plants to grow instead of just harvesting where plants naturally appeared. They didn't have a word for it yet. They didn't wake up and decide, today we're inventing agriculture. But that's exactly what they were doing. The climate crisis of the Younger Dryas was forcing the final transition from management to actual farming, from proto-agriculture to the real thing. The age of experimentation was ending. The agricultural revolution was about to begin. But here's where things get really interesting. Because the shift from temporary camps to semi-permanent settlements didn't happen because someone suddenly invented farming. It happened the other way round. People were already settling down before they knew how to farm. They were clustering around reliable resource patches, those year-round springs, those predictable stands of wild grains. And once you're staying in one place, once you're watching the same patch of wild wheat grow year after year, you start to notice things. You notice that the seeds that fall near your camp in the spring turn into new plants in the fall. You notice that the areas where you've been processing grain, where thousands of seeds have been scattered and trampled into the soil, those areas have denser stands of wheat the following year. You notice that some plants produce bigger seeds than others, and if you save those bigger seeds for planting, well, the next generation has even bigger seeds. This wasn't a eureka moment. This wasn't some ancient genius suddenly figuring out how agriculture works. This was thousands of people over hundreds of years, slowly, incrementally noticing patterns and acting on them. And it was happening in multiple places simultaneously. The epicenter was the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern-day Iraq and Syria and down into the Levant. Around 11,500 years ago, people in this region started doing something that seems almost absurdly simple in hindsight. They started saving seeds, not eating all the grain they collected, setting aside a portion, storing it through the winter, and deliberately planting it in the spring. At first, they were planting wild grains, the same species they'd been harvesting for millennia. But here's the thing about plants. They evolve fast, much faster than animals, and when you start selecting which seeds to save and plant, you become a force of natural selection. Wild wheat has a brittle rachis. That's the part that connects the seed to the stem. When the grain is ripe, the rachis shatters easily, scattering seeds everywhere. This is perfect for wild wheat, which needs to spread its seeds widely to maximize reproduction. But it's terrible for human harvesters. You're trying to gather grain, and it's falling apart in your hands, seeds scattering before you can collect them. So naturally, people would focus on gathering from plants that held together a little better, plants with a slightly tougher rachis that didn't shatter quite so easily. And when they saved seeds from those plants for planting, they were unconsciously selecting for that trait. Within just a few hundred years, maybe 20 or 30 generations, the wheat growing around these settlements had been transformed. Non-shattering rachis became standard. The plants were becoming dependent on human cultivation, because they couldn't effectively disperse their own seeds anymore. This was domestication. Not deliberate genetic engineering, but accidental selection happening at the intersection of human behavior and plant evolution. And it was happening to multiple species simultaneously. Wheat was domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. So was barley. So were lentils, peas, chickpeas, and flax. By 10,000 years ago, people in this region had developed a package of domesticated crops that could provide a complete diet. Grains for carbohydrates, legumes for protein, flax for fiber and oil. But cultivating plants is only half the agricultural revolution. The other half is animals, and this is where things get complicated, because domesticating animals requires a completely different set of conditions and a completely different relationship between humans and the natural world. You can't accidentally domesticate a sheep the way you can accidentally domesticate wheat. Animals don't just grow where you plant them. They move. They fight back. They have complex behaviors and social structures. Domesticating them requires capturing wild individuals, keeping them alive in captivity, convincing them to breed under human management, and then selecting for traits across multiple generations. The first animal to be domesticated wasn't even really an animal in the conventional sense. It was dogs, descended from wolves, and this domestication happened much earlier, probably 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, long before agriculture. But that was a special case, wolves self-domesticating by hanging around human camps and forming mutually beneficial relationships. Real livestock domestication, bringing wild herbivores under human management, that started around 11,000 years ago in the same Fertile Crescent region that was domesticating plants. Sheep were first. Wild sheep, actually wild mouflons, lived throughout the Middle East and had been hunted by humans for hundreds of thousands of years. But around 11,000 years ago, people started doing something different. Instead of just hunting wild flocks, they started capturing lambs and raising them. Probably this began as a way to keep fresh meat available year-round. Kill and eat the wild game you hunt, but keep some young animals alive so you have meat when hunting is difficult. But keeping wild animals alive is hard. You need to feed them, protect them from predators, prevent them from escaping. You need infrastructure, pens, enclosures, food storage. You need to be settled. Nomadic groups can't manage livestock effectively. You can't move camp every few weeks and bring your captive animals with you. Domestication required settlement, which is another reason why the process of settling down and the process of developing agriculture were so tightly linked. The sheep that survived in captivity were the ones that were calmer, less aggressive, more tolerant of human presence. Generation by generation, humans were selecting for docility. And within just a few thousand years, domesticated sheep had diverged significantly from their wild ancestors. Smaller bodies, shorter legs, woollier coats. They were becoming dependent on human care, just like the wheat with its non-shattering rachies. Goats came next, domesticated from wild bezoars around 10,500 years ago. Then cattle, descended from massive wild aurochs that stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder and had horns like spears. Domesticating aurochs was probably terrifying. These were animals that could easily kill a human. But by 10,000 years ago, people had figured out how to capture and breed them, slowly selecting for smaller size and calmer temperament. Pigs were domesticated around 9,000 years ago, descended from wild boars that roamed the forests of the Middle East and Europe. Unlike sheep, goats, and cattle, which are herd animals that could be managed together, pigs were more challenging. They're intelligent, stubborn, and extremely strong, but they're also incredibly efficient at converting garbage and scraps into meat, which made them perfect for settled communities that were generating waste. Now here's what's crucial to understand. This whole process, plant and animal domestication happening in the Fertile Crescent between 11,500 and 9,000 years ago, this wasn't happening because people suddenly decided to become farmers. It was happening because people had already started settling down, and the settlement created conditions where domestication became possible and advantageous. And once it started, once people had domesticated crops and livestock, the process accelerated. Because farming and herding created their own momentum. They made settlement more permanent, which made further agricultural development more practical, which made settlement even more permanent. A feedback loop that locked people into an agricultural lifestyle. But here's where the story gets even wilder, because this wasn't just happening in one place. Independent agricultural revolutions were erupting around the world in regions that had no contact with each other at roughly the same time. In China, around 11,000 years ago, people in the Yellow River Valley started domesticating millet. Slightly later, around 9,000 years ago, populations in the Yangtze River Valley domesticated rice. Different crops than the Fertile Crescent, different environmental conditions, but the same basic pattern. Sedentary communities arising around reliable resource patches, people noticing patterns in plant growth, unconscious selection leading to domestication. The Chinese domestication package eventually included pigs, chickens, and water buffalo. A completely different suite of animals than the Middle East, but fulfilling the same roles, providing meat, labor, and other resources for settled agricultural communities. In Mesoamerica, around 9,000 years ago, people started domesticating squash. Later came beans around 8,000 years ago, and then the big one, maize, corn, which was domesticated from a wild grass called teosinte, around 8,700 years ago. If you've ever seen teosinte, this domestication seems impossible. The wild plant produces tiny ears with maybe 5 or 6 seeds, each covered in a hard shell. It looks nothing like modern corn. But over thousands of years of selection, Mesoamerican farmers transformed it into one of the world's most productive crops. They also domesticated turkeys, the only large livestock available in the Americas. In Africa, agriculture developed independently in at least 3 different regions. The Ethiopian highlands saw domestication of teff, coffee and enseat around 7,000 years ago. The Sahel region of West Africa domesticated African rice, sorghum, and pearl millet around the same time, and in the Ethiopian highlands people domesticated cattle independently from the Middle Eastern domestication. The Papua New Guinea highlands developed agriculture around 9,000 years ago, domesticating taro, bananas, and yams. The eastern United States saw independent domestication of sunflowers, sumpweed, and goosefoot, though this agricultural system was eventually overwhelmed by crops spreading from Mesoamerica. All of these agricultural revolutions happened independently. People in China had no idea what was happening in the Middle East. Mesoamericans had no contact with Africans, yet they all developed agriculture within a few thousand years of each other. This tells us something profound. This shift to agriculture wasn't an unlikely accident that happened once and spread everywhere. It was almost inevitable, an emergent property of what happens when human populations grow large enough and settle densely enough in regions with domesticable plants and animals. But let's talk about what this actually meant for the people living through it. Because here's the thing about farming. It's not easier than hunting and gathering. It's actually much harder. Modern studies of hunter-gatherer societies show they typically work about 20 hours per week to obtain all the food they need. Early farmers were working 60, 70, maybe 80 hours per week, preparing fields, planting, weeding, protecting crops from animals and birds, harvesting, processing, storing. Agriculture is backbreaking labour, repetitive and exhausting. And the diet got worse. Hunter-gatherers eat an incredibly diverse diet, hundreds of different plant and animal species depending on season and availability. Early farmers ate maybe a dozen crops, sometimes just 2 or 3 staple grains, plus whatever they could supplement through hunting and gathering. Archaeological evidence shows that when people transitioned to agriculture, their health declined. Skeletal remains from early farming communities show increased rates of malnutrition, dental cavities, bone diseases indicating vitamin deficiencies, and reduced stature. So why did they do it? Why did people commit to a lifestyle that required more work, produced worse health outcomes, and locked them into permanent settlements where disease could spread more easily? The answer is population. Agriculture can support more people per square mile than hunting and gathering. A lot more, maybe 10 times more, maybe 100 times more depending on the environment. And once you start farming, once you have even a little bit of success producing food, your population starts growing. More food means more children survive to adulthood, means women can have babies closer together because they're not carrying children on long nomadic journeys, means elderly people can live longer because they don't need to keep pace with mobile groups. Population growth becomes exponential. And here's the trap. Once your population has grown beyond what the local wild resources can support, you can't go back to hunting and gathering. There are too many of you now. You're locked into agriculture whether you like it or not. You have to keep farming, keep increasing production, because there's no alternative. This is what anthropologists call the agricultural trap. Not a choice people made, but a process they got caught in. The time investment required was staggering. Preparing fields alone could take weeks. Without metal tools, clearing land meant using stone axes to cut down trees and burning the rest. Breaking ground meant using digging sticks to turn over soil, acre by acre, by hand. Planting meant walking every row, placing seeds individually or in small groups. Weeding meant hours bent over in the hot sun, pulling up unwanted plants by hand. Harvesting meant cutting every stalk individually with stone sickles. Processing meant threshing grain by hand, separating seeds from chaff, grinding them into flour using stone tools, but the payoff was storage. This is what made the whole system work. Grain can be stored for years if kept dry. Dried meat and fish can last months. Legumes can be stored almost indefinitely. For the first time in human history, people could accumulate food surpluses that would carry them through bad harvests, harsh winters, dry seasons. This required new technologies. Pottery for storage appeared around the same time as agriculture in multiple regions. Not because people suddenly figured out how to fire clay, but because settled agricultural communities needed durable waterproof containers. Granaries appeared, specialized structures designed to store large quantities of grain and protect them from moisture, pests, and theft. Underground pits, raised platforms, sealed rooms. Early farmers were constantly innovating new ways to preserve their harvests. The creation of surpluses changed human society at a fundamental level. For the first time, wealth could be accumulated. Some families had more stored food than others. Some had better land, more livestock, more productive fields. Inequality began to emerge. Not the temporary status differences that exist in all human societies, but permanent heritable disparities in access to resources. And the genetic changes were profound, both in humans and in the species we were domesticating. Lactose tolerance appeared in human populations that were herding cattle, a genetic mutation that allowed adults to digest milk, providing a huge nutritional advantage. Genes affecting starch digestion increased in frequency among populations eating grain-heavy diets. Our bodies were evolving to match our new agricultural lifestyle. The domesticated species were changing even faster. Dogs, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, all showing the same suite of changes. Smaller bodies, shorter legs, floppier ears, curlier tails, spotted coats. This collection of traits, called domestication syndrome, appears in almost every domesticated mammal. It's probably a side effect of selecting for docility, for tameness. The genes affecting behavior are linked to genes affecting physical appearance. The plants were transforming even more dramatically. Larger seeds, tougher stalks, more compact growth patterns. Within just a few thousand years, domesticated wheat, barley, corn and rice had diverged so far from their wild ancestors that they could barely interbreed. We had created new species, organisms that couldn't survive without human cultivation. By 9,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution was in full swing across multiple continents. Millions of people were now living in permanent settlements, cultivating domesticated crops, herding domesticated animals, and storing food surpluses that would have seemed impossible to their nomadic ancestors just a few thousand years earlier. The world was filling up again, but in a completely new way. Not scattered bands of nomads following wild herds and seasonal plants, but dense permanent communities of farmers anchored to the land. The human relationship with the planet had fundamentally changed. We weren't adapting to existing ecosystems anymore. We were creating new ecosystems, agricultural landscapes shaped by human labour and maintained by human effort. There was no going back now. The agricultural trap had closed. The population had grown too large. The knowledge of farming had spread too widely. Humanity was committed to this new way of life, for better or worse. And the villages, those clusters of permanent structures that had started as seasonal camps, they were about to become something much larger. Something that would change everything. So your ancestors have figured out farming. They've planted seeds, watched them grow, harvested the grain. They've started staying in one place for longer periods, building temporary shelters near their fields. But here's the thing. Once you commit to agriculture, once you've invested all that labour in planting and tending crops, you can't just walk away anymore. You have to be there when the plants need water. You have to protect them from animals and other humans. You have to be there for the harvest. And suddenly, without quite meaning to, without any grand plan or conscious decision, your people have become permanently settled. They've built the first villages. Now we need to be clear about what we mean by villages. These weren't just a few huts clustered together. These were permanent communities with structures designed to last for generations, with shared spaces, with plans. The earlier settlements we can still study today show an incredible level of sophistication. These weren't people stumbling blindly into settled life. These were intelligent, creative humans deliberately designing new ways to live. The most famous early settlement is Jericho, around 9,600 BCE, in the Jordan Valley. Humans built what might be the oldest continuous settlement in human history. When archaeologists first started excavating Jericho, they expected to find simple shelters, maybe some storage pits. What they found instead blew their minds. Jericho wasn't just a village, it was a town. At its peak it covered about 6 acres and housed maybe 2,000 people. That might not sound like much, but remember, just a few thousand years earlier, the entire human population in any given region might have been a few hundred individuals scattered across hundreds of square miles. The architecture was extraordinary. The houses weren't temporary structures you could abandon when resources ran out. They were permanent buildings made of mud bricks dried in the sun. Some had stone foundations. They had flat roofs where families could sleep in summer. They had internal rooms for storage and sleeping. Most incredibly, they had plaster floors that were regularly maintained and replastered, sometimes dozens of times over, the life of a house. This tells us something profound. These people weren't just living in these structures, they were investing in them, maintaining them, planning to pass them down to their children and grandchildren. But Jericho had something even more remarkable. A wall, not a fence to keep animals out, a massive stone wall 20 feet high in places, with a tower that rose even higher. This wall took thousands of hours of coordinated labor to build. It required planning, organization, a large workforce willing to contribute time and effort to a communal project. Some archaeologists think it was for defense against other human groups. Others believe it was protection against floods. Either way, it represents a fundamental shift in human thinking. These people weren't just protecting themselves as individuals or families, they were protecting the settlement itself, the permanent place they had created. Then there's Çatalhöyük. Located in what's now Turkey, this settlement emerged around 7,500 BCE and became one of the largest and most sophisticated Neolithic communities in the world. At its height, it housed between 3,000 and 8,000 people. But what makes Çatalhöyük truly weird, truly fascinating, is how it was designed. There were no streets, none. The houses were built wall to wall, pushed up against each other like a honeycomb. You couldn't walk between buildings because there was no space between them. So how did people get around? They walked on the roofs. The roofs were flat and strong, and they served as the community's streets and public spaces. To get into your house, you climbed down a ladder through a hole in the roof. Think about what this means for community life. Everyone had to walk past everyone else's house to get anywhere. Privacy, as we understand it, didn't really exist. Your neighbours literally walked over your head every day, but it also meant something else. It meant security. With no ground-level entrances, with walls shared between families, the entire settlement became a kind of fortress. You couldn't sneak into Çatalhöyük. You had to be invited in. The interiors of these houses show even more sophistication. People divided their spaces into different functional areas. There were sleeping platforms built along the walls, raised to keep people off the cold floor. There were hearths for cooking and heating, positioned to vent smoke through the roof entrance. There were storage areas built into the walls for grain, tools, and valuable items. And here's where it gets really interesting. Beneath the sleeping platforms, they buried their dead. Not in a cemetery outside the settlement. Right there, under the floor where you slept. Families lived with their ancestors, literally. Burials at Çatalhöyük show that people sometimes dug up old skeletons, removed the skulls, and kept them in the house. Archaeologists have found skulls plastered and painted, displayed in homes, like honoured relics. This suggests a completely different relationship with death than we have today. The dead weren't separated from the living. They remained part of the household, part of the family. Both Jericho and Çatalhöyük show us that permanent settlement forced humans to solve problems their nomadic ancestors never faced. When you're constantly moving, you don't have to worry about waste management. You just leave your garbage behind and nature deals with it. But when you're staying in one place permanently, waste becomes a serious issue. Human waste, food scraps, broken tools, ashes from fires, all of it accumulates. The archaeological record shows that early villagers developed systematic ways to deal with this. They created designated trash areas outside the main settlement. They learned to bury organic waste to reduce smells and keep away scavengers. They developed communal toilet areas, usually on the outskirts of settlements. Some communities dug pits specifically for waste disposal, the first landfills in human history. But waste management was just one of many new challenges. Permanent settlement also meant humans had to develop entirely new concepts about property and ownership. When you're nomadic, you only own what you can carry. Territory might be loosely claimed by a group, but it's vast, flexible, and shared. Individual ownership of specific pieces of land doesn't make much sense when everyone is constantly moving. But when you build a permanent house, when you invest months or years of labor into constructing walls and floors, when you plant fields that will feed your family for generations, suddenly the land itself becomes valuable in a completely new way. The house is yours. The field is yours. The storage pit filled with grain you've harvested is yours, and you're willing to defend these things because they represent your survival and your future. Archaeological evidence suggests that concepts of private property emerged almost immediately with permanent settlement. At Çatalhöyük, each house was clearly a family unit. Families controlled their own space, decorated it uniquely, buried their own dead beneath their own floors. There's no evidence of communal housing or shared domestic spaces. This was private property in the most fundamental sense, but property ownership created something humans had never really dealt with before: inequality. When you're nomadic, everyone is roughly equal because nobody can accumulate much stuff. The strongest hunter might have slightly better tools, but there are limits to how much advantage any individual can gain. But in a settled village, some families inevitably end up with better land, more productive fields, larger houses. Over generations, these advantages compound. Wealth begins to accumulate in certain families, and with wealth comes power. The evidence for social stratification appears surprisingly quickly in the archaeological record. Within just a few generations of permanent settlement, we start seeing differences in house sizes, in burial goods, in access to resources. Some people were getting more than others. Some families were becoming more important than others. This led to the development of specialized roles within communities. In nomadic bands, everyone had to be a generalist. Sure, some people might be better hunters or better at finding plants, but everyone needed to be able to do everything. You couldn't afford to have someone who only made tools or only tended fires. Everyone had to contribute to survival in multiple ways. But in permanent villages with reliable food supplies from agriculture, specialization became possible. Some people could focus entirely on making tools and trade their work for food. Others could specialize in pottery, weaving, or construction. The archaeological record shows this happening within just a few generations of settlement. Pottery, for instance, doesn't really make sense for nomadic people. It's heavy, fragile, and you can't carry much of it. Nomads used containers made from gourds, animal bladders, or woven baskets. But for settled communities, pottery was revolutionary. You could store grain for years, protecting it from moisture and pests. You could cook in new ways, making stews and porridges that were impossible with previous technologies. You could ferment foods and drinks, creating beer and preserved vegetables. The earliest pottery appears around 18,000 years ago in China, but it doesn't become common until people start settling permanently. Then it explodes. Every settlement starts producing pottery in distinctive local styles. And here's the thing about pottery: it requires real skill. You need to know which clays work, how to shape them, what temperature to fire them at. It takes years to master. So pottery specialists emerged, people who did nothing but make pots, trading their work for food and other goods. The same thing happened with weaving. When you're nomadic, you wear animal skins because they're durable and warm. But settled communities could grow flax and cotton. They could raise sheep for wool. Suddenly, textile production became possible, and textiles are labour-intensive. Growing the plants, processing the fibres, spinning thread, weaving cloth. Each step requires specialised knowledge and considerable time. So weavers emerged as specialised craftspeople. This specialisation created a cascade of social changes. When you have specialists who don't produce their own food, you need systems for exchanging goods and services. You need someone to organise the distribution of food to non-farmers. You need ways to settle disputes about who owes what to whom. In other words, you need governance. The archaeological evidence suggests that organised leadership structures emerged very early in permanent settlements. At Çatalhöyük, some houses are significantly larger and more elaborately decorated than others. These were probably the homes of important families, people with special status in the community. Some structures seem to have served ritual or communal functions, suggesting organised religious practices that brought the community together. Speaking of religion, permanent settlement transformed spiritual life as profoundly as it transformed everything else. Nomadic peoples certainly had religious beliefs and practices, but settled communities developed something more elaborate. Organised religion with priests, temples, and complex rituals. At several early settlements, archaeologists have found buildings that are clearly not ordinary houses. They're too large, too elaborately decorated, filled with symbolic imagery and ritual objects. These are the first temples, the first permanent spaces dedicated specifically to religious practice. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, massive stone pillars were erected with carved reliefs of animals and abstract symbols around 9600 BCE. This site predates permanent villages in the region, suggesting that in some places religion might have actually driven people to settle, rather than settlement driving religious development. But once villages were established, religious spaces became central to community life. At Çatalhöyük, many houses contain elaborate wall paintings, bull skulls mounted on walls, and plastered sculptures of animals and human figures. These weren't just decorations. They were part of a complex symbolic system, a shared religious world view that helped bind the community together. This makes sense when you think about the challenges of permanent settlement. When you have hundreds or thousands of people living in close proximity, you need mechanisms to maintain social cohesion. You need shared values and common purposes. Religion provided this. Shared rituals, shared sacred spaces, shared beliefs about the world and humanity's place in it. These things created community identity in a way that hadn't been necessary for small nomadic bands where everyone was related by blood. But permanent settlement also created new sources of conflict. When you're nomadic, you can usually just avoid other groups if tensions arise. You move to different territories, give each other space. But when you've built permanent villages, when you've invested years of labour in fields and buildings, you can't just leave when conflicts develop. You have to stay and defend what you've built. The archaeological evidence for violence increases dramatically after permanent settlement begins. The wall at Jericho is just the beginning. Within a few thousand years, settlements all over the world are building defensive structures, walls, ditches, watchtowers. These aren't protections against wild animals. These are fortifications against other humans. At some sites, archaeologists have found evidence of systematic violence. mass graves with bodies showing signs of trauma, burned buildings, hordes of valuables hastily buried, suggesting people trying to hide their wealth before fleeing an attack. Permanent settlement had created something worth fighting over. Territory, stored food, valuable goods, and humans were willing to kill to protect what was theirs or to take what belonged to others. This was the dark side of settlement, the emergence of organized warfare, of territorial conflicts that could escalate into sustained violence. Nomadic groups certainly fought each other sometimes, but their conflicts were limited by mobility. Everyone could just leave. But settled communities couldn't leave. They had to fight or surrender everything they'd built. So within just a few thousand years of humans building the first permanent villages, all the fundamental structures of civilization had emerged. Private property and social inequality, specialized labor and economic exchange, organized religion and communal ritual spaces, defensive fortifications and territorial warfare. These weren't things that developed gradually over tens of thousands of years. They appeared suddenly, a direct consequence of permanent settlement. And it was irreversible. Once you've built a village, once you've invested that much labor and emotion and identity in a specific place, you can't easily go back to nomadic life. You're tied to the land now, to your house, to your fields. For better and worse, humans had stopped wandering. They had put down roots. They had become villagers. The age of nomadic humanity was over. The age of civilization had begun. Here's the uncomfortable truth about the agricultural revolution. It made most people's lives worse. Not immediately, not in ways that would make anyone want to go back. But if you could somehow transport a nomadic hunter-gatherer from 13,000 years ago and show them what their descendants were doing in those first farming villages, they'd probably think those people were insane, because settlement wasn't some triumphant march towards civilization. It was a devil's bargain. And the bill came due in human bodies. Let's start with the most visible change, the one written directly in the bones. Early farmers were shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, not just a little shorter. We're talking about a loss of 4 to 6 inches in average height, within just a few generations after communities settled down. Archaeological sites from the Fertile Crescent show this pattern clearly. The nomadic peoples buried in sites from 13,000 years ago were tall, often 5'9" or 5'10" for men. By 8,000 years ago, after a few thousand years of agriculture, average male height had dropped to around 5'3". This wasn't genetic, this was malnutrition, and it tells us something crucial about what happened when humans stopped moving. Hunter-gatherers ate an incredibly diverse diet. Studies of modern foraging peoples show they typically consume 50 to 100 different plant and animal species throughout the year. Nuts, berries, roots, tubers, game animals, fish, birds, insects, mushrooms, seasonal fruits. Their diet varied constantly, which meant their nutrition was comprehensive. They got everything they needed: proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, all from wild sources that were naturally nutrient-dense. Then we settled down and started eating wheat, or barley, or rice, or corn, depending on which part of the world you lived in. Suddenly, 60, 70, sometimes 80% of calories came from a single crop. Sure, people supplemented with other foods, but the backbone of the diet became cereal grains. And here's the thing about cereal grains: they're calorically dense, which is why they work for supporting settled populations. But they're nutritionally incomplete. They lack certain essential amino acids. They're low in vitamins A and C. They don't provide adequate fat-soluble vitamins. The archaeological evidence of this dietary shift is brutal. skeletal remains from early farming communities show widespread signs of nutritional stress. Porotic hyperostosis, a thickening of the skull bones caused by iron deficiency anemia, becomes common in farming populations. So do dental hyperplasias, lines of defective enamel formation on teeth that form during childhood malnutrition. And those shorter statures? That's what happens when children don't get adequate protein and micronutrients during their growth years, but it gets worse. Because it's not just about what early farmers were eating, it's about what was eating them. Settlement created the perfect conditions for infectious disease, and this changed human health more than any other single factor. Think about it from a pathogen's perspective. For millions of years, humans lived in small mobile groups of maybe 20 to 50 people. If a disease outbreak hit a nomadic band, it might kill a few people, maybe wipe out the whole group if it was particularly nasty. But then the disease would die out too, because there weren't enough new hosts to sustain transmission. Pathogens that evolved to infect humans had to either be chronic infections that could persist in small populations, or zoonotic diseases that jumped from animals to humans occasionally but couldn't sustain human-to-human transmission. This limited the types of diseases our ancestors faced. Then we built villages. Suddenly you have 200, 500, eventually thousands of people living in close proximity, and we weren't just living close to each other, we were living close to our own waste. Nomadic peoples didn't worry much about sanitation. You use an area as a latrine, then you move on. The ecosystem processes the waste, and by the time you return months or years later, everything's been recycled. But settled peoples couldn't move on. They were stuck in place and human waste accumulated. Wells got contaminated. Food storage areas attracted rodents. Living spaces became crowded and unsanitary by modern standards. This created what epidemiologists call a disease pool. Enough people living close enough together that infectious diseases could sustain continuous transmission. Measles, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis. None of these could exist in nomadic populations. They all require continuous chains of infection among large settled groups, and then we added animals to the mix. Because settled peoples didn't just farm plants, they domesticated animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens. We brought them into our villages, kept them in pens, slaughtered them in our living spaces, drank their milk, wore their skins, and those animals brought their diseases with them. Cattle gave us tuberculosis and measles. Pigs gave us influenza. Chickens gave us typhoid fever. These zoonotic diseases jumped to humans, then evolved to spread person to person in our dense settlements. The epidemiological evidence suggests that most of the infectious diseases that would plague human civilizations for the next 10,000 years emerged during this period, the first few thousand years after settlement. The skeletal record confirms this nightmare. Early farming communities show much higher rates of infectious disease markers than hunter-gatherer populations. Periosteal reactions, bone formations caused by chronic infections, become common. So do pathologies associated with tuberculosis, treponematosis, and other bacterial infections. Life expectancy probably dropped. We can't measure this precisely because the archaeological record is incomplete, but the pattern of skeletal remains suggests early farmers died younger than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, not from old age, but from the diseases and malnutrition that came with settled life. And then there's the work. Because farming is hard, much harder than most people realize. There's this persistent myth that hunter-gatherers worked constantly, struggling to find enough food, while farmers worked less because they could produce more. The ethnographic evidence says exactly the opposite. Studies of modern foraging peoples show they typically work about 3 to 5 hours per day obtaining food. They spend the rest of their time resting, socializing, making tools, telling stories. Their work is varied, sometimes hunting, sometimes gathering, sometimes processing foods, and it's paced to the rhythm of the seasons. Early farmers, they work their backs nearly to breaking. Because agriculture isn't just planting seeds and waiting for harvest. It's clearing land, which means cutting down trees or removing stones by hand. It's ploughing, which meant pushing a pointed stick through tough soil for hours every day or later, controlling oxen that could crush you if they decided to. It's planting, weeding, protecting crops from birds and animals, irrigating if you're lucky enough to have water sources. Then comes harvest, which is brutally intensive labor compressed into a few weeks. You have to cut the grain, bundle it, transport it, thresh it to separate the grain from the chaff, winnow it to remove debris, then store it somewhere that rodents and insects won't destroy it. And you can't stop, because if you don't do all this work, you don't eat. Nomadic peoples could move to new resource patches if one area was depleted. Farmers were locked in place. If your crops failed, you starved. The skeletal evidence shows what this work did to human bodies. Arthritis becomes much more common in farming populations, especially in the lower back and knees. So do compression fractures of the vertebrae from carrying heavy loads. Women's skeletons show particular stress markers in the joints of the arms and wrists, probably from the repetitive motion of grinding grain for hours every day. And here's the really dark part. This hard work didn't translate to better nutrition or easier lives. It translated to supporting more people on the same amount of land. Agricultural communities could support much higher population densities than nomadic groups. But the quality of life for individuals went down. Anthropologists call this the agricultural trap. Once you start farming, you can support more children. Those children survive to adulthood and have their own children. Population grows. But now you need even more food production, so you clear more land, work harder, and the cycle continues. You can't go back because there are too many people to support by foraging. You're locked into agriculture even though it's making your life worse. But perhaps the most profound cost of settlement wasn't physical, it was social. Hunter-gatherer societies are remarkably egalitarian. Not perfectly equal, some individuals have more prestige or influence than others, but wealth accumulation is nearly impossible. You can't own more than you can carry. Resources are shared because everyone depends on cooperation for survival. Leadership is informal and situational. The best hunter might lead during a hunt. The person who knows plants might lead during gathering expeditions. But nobody has permanent authority over others. Settlement changed this completely. Because now you could accumulate stuff. You could store surplus grain, own land, possess tools and animals and buildings, and some people ended up with more than others. The archaeological evidence shows this transition clearly. Early hunter-gatherer sites show minimal variation in burial goods or dwelling sizes. Everyone had roughly the same stuff. But as communities settled and adopted agriculture, inequality appears in the archaeological record like a wound opening. By 9,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, you start seeing different-sized houses. Some families have large, well-built dwellings. Others live in smaller structures. Some burials are elaborate, with grave goods like polished stone axes, obsidian blades, shell ornaments. Other burials are simple, just a body in a pit. This is the birth of social class, and it happened fast. Within just a few generations of settlement, Human societies that had been essentially egalitarian for millions of years developed distinct hierarchies. Why? Because agriculture created surplus, and surplus creates power. If you control the granary, you control who eats. If you own the best farmland, you can demand labor from others to work it. If you possess the animals and tools necessary for farming, people become dependent on you. The families that got established early, that claimed the best land when communities were first forming, could pass these advantages to their children. For the first time in human history, your life prospects were largely determined by which family you were born into. Elite lineages emerged. So did poor families who worked the land but owned little of it. And this inequality created something humans had never really needed before: government. Because once you have haves and have-nots, you need someone to enforce the system. You need authority to resolve disputes, especially when those disputes involve property. You need organization to coordinate large-scale farming projects. You need leaders who can make decisions for the whole community. In early villages, this might have been a council of elders or a strong man who commanded respect. But the pattern was set. Settlement created inequality. Inequality created hierarchy. And hierarchy created power structures that would eventually become the kingdoms and empires of recorded history. Gender relations changed too, and not for the better if you were a woman. In most hunter-gatherer societies, women's gathering work provides the majority of calories, which gives them considerable economic and social power. Decision-making is often collective, with women having significant voices, but agriculture shifted the balance. Farming, especially plough agriculture, was dominated by men. So was the herding of the large animals. Women's work increasingly focused on domestic tasks, processing grain, making textiles, raising children. These were essential jobs, but they were less visible than men's agricultural work and gave women less economic leverage. The archaeological record hints at this transition. In early hunter-gatherer burials, men and women are often buried with similar grave goods, suggesting similar status. As agricultural societies develop, men's graves increasingly contain prestige items, tools, weapons, while women's graves contain domestic items, grinding stones, spindle whorls. This pattern isn't universal. Some agricultural societies remained relatively egalitarian. But the general trend is clear. Settlement and agriculture created conditions that favoured patriarchal social structures, and this would shape human societies for the next 10,000 years. Then there's what settlement did to the environment, because humans had never stayed in one place long enough to fundamentally alter the landscape. Now they did. Forests were. Forests, cleared for farmland. This wasn't selective harvesting. This was clear-cutting entire hillsides and valleys to make room for wheat fields, the first deforestation, the first permanent alteration of natural ecosystems on a large scale. Soil erosion followed. Natural vegetation holds soil in place. Remove it, and rain washes the topsoil away. Archaeological sites in the Fertile Crescent show layers of eroded soil accumulating in valley bottoms, evidence that hillsides were being stripped of their covering within a few centuries of intensive agriculture. Water systems were altered. Rivers were diverted for irrigation. Marshlands were drained to create farmland. These modifications created productive agricultural land, but they also disrupted the ecosystems that wild plants and animals depended on. Certain species were driven to local extinction. Large predators that threatened livestock were hunted down. Wild relatives of domesticated plants were sometimes eliminated to prevent cross-pollination with crops. The landscape was being simplified, made more productive for humans, but less hospitable for everything else. This was humanity's first major environmental impact, and it established a pattern that continues today. Humans modifying nature to increase food production, creating short-term abundance while depleting long-term ecological resilience. So why didn't people just go back? If settlement made life harder, shorter, more diseased, more unequal, why didn't those early farmers look around, realize they'd made a terrible mistake, and return to the nomadic lifestyle that had served humanity so well for millions of years? Because they couldn't. The door had closed behind them. Remember, agricultural populations grew rapidly. Within a few generations of settlement, there were simply too many people to support by foraging. The surrounding hunting and gathering territories couldn't sustain the population that agriculture had enabled. Plus, children. Nomadic women typically have children every 4 years or so, because you can't travel while carrying more than one small child. But settled women can have children every 2 years, sometimes even more frequently. Agricultural communities had baby booms, and all those children needed to be fed. The skills were being lost too. Each generation of farmers was less practiced in hunting and foraging than their parents. The knowledge of seasonal movements, animal behavior, plant locations, all the accumulated wisdom of nomadic life, it was fading. After just a few generations, going back would have meant relearning everything. And maybe most importantly, people had invested too much. They'd cleared land, built houses, planted orchards, established villages. Walking away from all that felt impossible, you'd be abandoning everything your family had worked for, so communities pushed forward. They dealt with the diseases by developing herbs and basic medicines. They coped with malnutrition by occasionally hunting or gathering wild foods to supplement their diets. They adapted to the harder work because they had no choice. And slowly, over generations, the memory of nomadic freedom faded. Children born into farming villages knew no other life. The old ways became myths, stories told around fires about ancestors who wandered freely and lived by the rhythms of nature. But those ancestors were gone, and settlement, with all its costs and contradictions, had become the only path forward. But here's where the story gets absolutely wild. Because settlement didn't just change where humans lived, it changed everything. And I mean everything. The way we think, the way we organize ourselves, the very structure of human civilization. All of it traces back to that moment when someone decided to stay put and plant seeds instead of following the herds. Let's start with the most obvious change: population. Because here's the thing about hunter-gatherers. They're really good at staying alive in harsh conditions, but they're terrible at making lots of babies. A nomadic woman might have a child every 4 years, maybe 5. You can't have babies more frequently than that when you're constantly on the move, carrying everything you own, walking 10, 15 miles a day. Infants are heavy. Toddlers slow you down. Natural selection favoured spacing out births to maximise the survival of each child. But settled farming communities? Completely different story. A woman in an early agricultural village might have a child every 2 years, sometimes less. She doesn't have to carry them everywhere. She's got a permanent house, storage facilities, a community of other mothers who can help with childcare. The constraints that limited hunter-gatherer reproduction just vanished. The math gets crazy fast. Let's say a hunter-gatherer population of 1,000 people grows at maybe 0.5% per year. That's generous. At that rate, it takes 140 years to double the population. But an agricultural population growing at 2% per year, which was common in early farming societies, doubles in just 35 years, 4 times faster. Within a few generations, farming communities weren't just slightly larger than hunter-gatherer bands, they were orders of magnitude bigger. A successful farming village of 1,000 people could expand to 2,000 in a generation, 4,000 in 2 generations, 8,000 in 3. Within 500 years, you're talking about tens of thousands of people descended from that original village, spreading across the landscape, founding new settlements, pushing into territories that hunter-gatherers had occupied for millennia. This wasn't gradual, this was explosive. Archaeological evidence shows that once farming took hold in a region, hunter-gatherer populations either adopted agriculture themselves or got displaced, pushed into marginal territories where farming wasn't viable. It wasn't because farmers were better warriors, though they would become that eventually. It was simply numbers. When you've got 10 farmers for every hunter-gatherer, you can afford more casualties in conflicts over resources. You can send out more foraging parties, occupy more territory, exploit resources more intensively. The hunter-gatherers didn't stand a chance. But population growth created its own problems. When you've got hundreds or thousands of people living in close proximity, sharing resources, trading goods, you can't just keep track of everything in your head anymore. The old ways don't work. In a hunter-gatherer band of 30 people, everyone knows everyone. Social relationships are personal and immediate. If someone owes you something, you remember. If there's a dispute, the whole group can sit down and hash it out around the fire. But in a farming village of 500 people, forget it. You can't maintain personal relationships with everyone. You can't remember who contributed what to the harvest, who owes grain to whom, which families have trading agreements with which others. The cognitive load becomes impossible. So humans did what humans do best when faced with an impossible problem. They invented a solution. They invented writing. Now, this didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen everywhere at once. The earliest writing systems emerged around 3200 BCE in ancient Sumer in what's now Iraq. But they didn't spring fully formed out of nowhere. They evolved from earlier systems of record-keeping that went back thousands of years. The first proto-writing wasn't poetry or history or religious texts. It was accounting, literally just lists. This person has 20 sheep. That person owes 5 bushels of barley. This temple received 100 jars of oil as tribute. The earliest written documents we've found are basically ancient spreadsheets. Cuneiform tablets from Sumerian cities recording grain stores, livestock inventories, labor obligations. Because when you've got thousands of people and complex economic relationships, you need to write things down or the whole system collapses into chaos. And once you've got writing for economic purposes, it doesn't take long before someone realizes you can use it for other things too. Within a few centuries of the first accounting tablets, Sumerian scribes were recording laws, composing poetry, writing down religious texts and historical chronicles. Writing became the foundation of everything we think of as civilization. Laws that could be referenced and enforced consistently across large populations. Religious teachings that could be preserved exactly and passed down through generations. Scientific and mathematical knowledge that could be accumulated and built upon instead of being rediscovered each generation. Speaking of mathematics, that's another direct consequence of settlement. Hunter-gatherers needed some basic math. Counting, simple addition and subtraction, spatial, reasoning for tracking animals. But farming societies needed something much more sophisticated. They needed to calculate harvest yields, predict when floods would come, divide land fairly, assess taxes, measure distances for irrigation channels. The development of complex mathematics happened in settled agricultural societies because those were the societies that desperately needed it. The Sumerians developed base 60 arithmetic, which is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. They figured out basic geometry to survey fields and calculate areas. The Egyptians developed sophisticated mathematical techniques for engineering pyramids and predicting Nile floods. The Babylonians created astronomical mathematics that could predict eclipses centuries in advance. None of this happens in nomadic societies, not because nomadic people were less intelligent, but because they didn't need it. The problems that require advanced mathematics only emerge when you've got large populations, complex resource management, and permanent infrastructure. And with mathematics came administration. Because here's the thing about a farming community of 5,000 people. You can't run it like a hunter-gatherer band where everyone has equal say and decisions are made by consensus. The information processing requirements are too high. Instead, you get hierarchy, specialists who spend their time organizing labor, managing resources, resolving disputes, planning for the future. You get chiefs, priests, administrators, tax collectors. You get social stratification, where some people have authority and wealth while others don't. The archaeological record shows this happening independently in every region where agriculture developed. Early farming villages start out relatively egalitarian. Houses are similar sizes. Graves contain similar goods. But within a few generations you see divergence. Bigger houses for some families, richer grave goods for certain individuals, storage facilities that clearly belong to specific people or institutions. Eventually you get monumental architecture, palaces and temples that require thousands of person-hours to construct and clearly represent centralized authority. This isn't because settled people were more power-hungry than nomads. It's because complex societies require complex administration, and complex administration requires hierarchy. You literally can't organize thousands of people for large-scale projects without some kind of command structure. Try to build an irrigation system or defensive wall by pure consensus, and you'll still be arguing about the plan when the drought comes or the enemy attacks. But hierarchy enabled something that would prove even more transformative: specialized labor. In a hunter-gatherer society, everyone does basically the same things. Everyone knows how to find food, make tools, build shelters. There's some specialization, sure. Certain individuals might be particularly skilled hunters or especially knowledgeable about plants. But fundamentally, everyone's a generalist because survival requires it. Settled agricultural societies change that completely. When you've got stored food surpluses, you can afford to have people who don't produce their own food. You can have full-time craftspeople who do nothing but make pottery or weave textiles or work metal. You can have merchants who spend their time trading goods between communities. You can have priests and scholars who specialize in knowledge and ritual. Most importantly, you can have innovators who spend their time experimenting with new technologies instead of spending every day finding their next meal. The result was a technological explosion unlike anything the world had seen. Hunter-gatherers developed stone tool technology over millions of years. Slowly, gradually, each improvement taking millennia to spread. But settled societies? They went from simple clay pots to wheeled vehicles in just a few thousand years. They invented the plough, the loom, metallurgy, glass-making, advanced ceramics. They figured out how to smelt copper, then bronze, then iron. Each innovation building on the last, each specialist contributing their piece to an accelerating technological revolution. Trade networks exploded too. Hunter-gatherers traded, sure. Archaeological evidence shows exotic materials moving hundreds of miles even in Paleolithic times. But the scale was tiny compared to what emerged with agriculture. Settled communities produced surpluses, more grain than they could eat, more pottery than they needed, more textiles than they could wear. So they traded the surplus for things they couldn't produce themselves. Obsidian from volcanic regions, copper from specific ore deposits, shells from the coast, exotic foods and luxury goods. Within a few thousand years of agriculture's emergence, trade networks spanned entire continents. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan ended up in Egyptian tombs. Tin from Cornwall was combined with copper from Cyprus to make bronze tools in Greece. Silk from China reached Roman markets through trade routes spanning 4,000 miles. These weren't simple exchanges between neighbours. These were complex economic systems with professional merchants, standardised weights and measures, even early forms of currency. All made possible because settled societies produce surpluses worth trading. And where you have trade, you have cities. Because cities are essentially nodes in trade networks, places where goods accumulate, get processed, and get redistributed. The first cities emerged around 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, places with populations in the tens of thousands, sometimes more, concentrations of wealth and power unlike anything that had existed before. These weren't just big villages, they were fundamentally different entities with their own logic and requirements. Cities needed constant food imports from the surrounding countryside. They needed sophisticated water management, waste disposal, social organization. They needed laws and law enforcement, courts and contracts, all the apparatus of state authority. And once you have cities, you have civilization in the formal sense. The word civilization comes from the Latin word for city. And that's not a coincidence. All the things we associate with civilization, writing, mathematics, monumental architecture, complex religion, formalized government, they all emerged in urban contexts because cities both required and enabled them. The first true civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, they all developed independently in different parts of the world, but they all follow the same basic pattern. Agriculture leads to population growth. Population growth leads to villages, then towns, then cities. Cities lead to writing, specialized labor, and complex administration. And complex administration leads to states, empires, and everything that follows. But here's what's really wild. Those early settlement patterns, those first villages and cities, they're still shaping our world today. Modern political boundaries often trace back to ancient agricultural territories. France roughly corresponds to the area where people spoke a particular dialect and grew particular crops 2,000 years ago. China's borders reflect regions unified by early agricultural civilizations along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. The Middle East's complex politics partly derive from settlement patterns, established when agriculture first emerged there 12,000 years ago. Cities that were founded 5,000 or 6,000 years ago are still major urban centers today. Baghdad, Damascus, Athens, Beijing. Places that became important because of their position in ancient trade networks remain important for essentially the same reasons. We've added highways and airports, but we're still using infrastructure networks whose basic patterns were established in the Bronze Age. And the social structures that emerged with settlement, they're still with us too. Concepts of property ownership, the idea that you can own land or resources rather than just using them. That comes from agriculture. You plant a field, you own the harvest. You build a house, you own the house. Hunter-gatherers didn't think that way because they couldn't. You can't own territory you're going to leave in a few weeks. Hierarchy and social stratification, the idea that some people have authority over others based on position rather than personal qualities. That's a product of agricultural societies needing administrative structures, specialized labor and professional identity. The idea that you're a farmer or a carpenter or teacher rather than just a person who farms or builds or teaches, that comes from settlement allowing and requiring specialization. Even our concept of time changed. Hunter-gatherers experienced time cyclically following the seasons and animal migrations. But farmers needed to think about time differently. Planting happens at specific times. Harvests come in predictable cycles. Storage means planning months or years ahead. The invention of the calendar wasn't just a technical achievement. It represented a fundamental shift in how humans conceptualize their existence in time. We became future-oriented in a way our ancestors never were. We started thinking in terms of quarters and years and generations, planning for futures we might not live to see. We're still living in the world that settlement created 12,000 years ago. Every city, every border, every government, every economic system, every aspect of modern life traces back to that moment when humans stopped moving and started staying. The last 12,000 years haven't been a series of separate developments. They've been one continuous process, the working out of all the implications contained in that single decision to plant seeds and wait for them to grow. And here's the thing that should really blow your mind. It all happened in less than 1% of human history. Anatomically, modern humans emerged at least 300,000 years ago. For 288,000 of those years, we were nomads. Every human who ever lived was a nomad. Then, in just 12,000 years, less than 4% of our species' existence, we completely transformed ourselves and the planet. That's how powerful settlement was. That's how completely it changed everything. So here we are. After 12,000 years of living in the world that settlement created, it's worth taking a moment to really sit with what happened back then. Because here's the thing, the transition from nomadic to settled life wasn't just another chapter in human history. It was the chapter, the one that determined everything that came after. Think about the magnitude of this shift. For roughly 300,000 years, modern humans had lived one way, moving with the seasons, following animal migrations, harvesting wild plants as they ripened, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Their ancestors had lived that way for millions of years before them. Homo erectus was nomadic. Homo habilis was nomadic. Every human species that had ever existed had been nomadic. It was the default human condition, the way we were built to live. Then, in the span of just a few thousand years, which is basically a blink in evolutionary terms, a handful of groups in different parts of the world made a different choice. They stopped moving. They planted seeds. They built permanent houses. They committed themselves to single locations in ways no human had ever done before. And here's what's wild about that choice. It was irreversible. Not because they couldn't physically return to nomadic life. Some groups did, at least temporarily. But because the world they'd created through settlement was fundamentally different from the one they'd left behind. Once you've got stored grain, you need to protect it. Once you've got permanent houses, you need to maintain them. Once your population density increases beyond a certain point, You can't go back to hunter-gatherer resource levels. They wouldn't support you anymore. The moment those first farmers planted their fields and built their villages, they locked their descendants into a new way of being human. Every person who came after would be born into a world shaped by that decision. A world of property and inequality, yes, but also a world of cities and writing, medicine and mathematics, art and architecture. Everything we call civilization emerged from that single revolutionary choice to stop moving. We are all descendants of settlers, whether your ancestors were among the first farmers in the Fertile Crescent, or they adopted agriculture thousands of years later, or they were still nomadic when European colonizers arrived with guns and diseases. You're living in the world that settlement created. You're sitting or lying down right now, probably in a permanent structure, possibly looking at stored food in your kitchen, definitely surrounded by possessions you couldn't carry if you had to move tomorrow. That's the legacy of the Neolithic Revolution. But it's also worth remembering what we lost. Those nomadic ancestors of ours weren't primitive or backwards. They were sophisticated, skilled, deeply knowledgeable about their environments. They had social systems that promoted equality and sharing. They had rich cultural lives full of art and story and ritual. They lived in ways that were sustainable for hundreds of thousands of years, something we're still struggling to figure out after just 12,000 years of settlement. Understanding this history, really sitting with it, connects us to something profound. We're not separate from our ancestors. We're not fundamentally different from those people who made the choice to settle. We're dealing with the same basic human drives, the need for security, the desire to provide for our children, the tendency to take short-term solutions even when they create long-term problems. The same intelligence that let them domesticate wheat and build villages is the intelligence you're using right now to understand this story. We're all part of this vast human experiment that started 12,000 years ago, still figuring out how to live in the world that settlement created, still grappling with the consequences of choices our ancestors made when the climate warmed and the ice sheets retreated. If this journey through deep history resonated with you, if it changed how you think about the world around you, or the food on your plate, or the house you live in, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment telling me what surprised you most about this story. And here's something I'm genuinely curious about. Where are you listening from? What part of the world are you in? And do you know when your ancestors made the transition from nomadic to settled life? Drop it in the comments. I read them all, and I love seeing where this story reaches, because ultimately that's what history is. Not dusty facts about dead people, but the living story of how we got here, how we became the people we are, the choices our ancestors made for better and worse that shape the world we inherited. Understanding that story, really understanding it, that's how we figure out where we might go next. Sweet dreams, fellow descendants of the settlers. May your sleep be as deep as the roots those first farmers planted 12,000 years ago.